Two people retire on the exact same day. Let's call them Ellen and Frank. On paper, a calculator could not tell them apart. Same age, 65. Same savings, right around $1 million, which they both spent 40 years building. Same plan, pull out 4% a year and let the rest keep growing. Same everything. Two identical people walking out of two identical offices with two identical retirement parties and two identical reassuring numbers. 30 years later, Ellen dies at 95, comfortable, with more money than she retired with. Her kids inherit a small fortune. Frank, meanwhile, ran out at 79. 16 years in, the account hit zero. And he spent his last years rationing, calling his children to ask for help, doing grocery math in the parking lot like he was 25 again, instead of collapsing back into it at the end. Same starting money, same withdrawal plan, same discipline. One died rich, one died scared, and here's the part that should genuinely bother you. Neither of them did anything wrong. Neither of them made a mistake. The thing that decided their two completely opposite endings was not a choice. It was luck neither of them could see, hidden inside math that told them both they were safe. My name is Wealth Peak, and today I'm going to open up the retirement math that nobody actually wants to show you the inside of. And I need to say one thing right away, before your stomach drops, because I know where this is heading in your head. No, the conclusion is not you're doomed, give up, retirement is a myth. I promise you it isn't, and I'll prove it by the end. This is not a doom video. It's the opposite. Because the only thing more dangerous than a scary retirement number is a comforting one you believe too much. What I'm about to show you doesn't make retirement impossible. It makes it real, and real is something you can actually plan for. A fantasy is not. So stick with me, because the goal here is to trade a comforting lie for an uncomfortable truth that will genuinely make you safer. Let's start with the number itself, because the number is where the whole illusion begins. You did the responsible thing. At some point you found a retirement calculator, you plugged in your age, your savings, your income, and it thought for a second and gave you a target. Let's say it told you that you need $1 million. And that number felt amazing, didn't it? Not because $1 million is small, but because it was a number. It was certainty. It turned a terrifying fog into a single clean target you could aim at. Hit the number, you're safe. Miss it, you're not. Beautifully simple. Except that number is an average. And here's the thing nobody says out loud about averages. Nobody actually retires into an average. The calculator took the long-run average return of the market, somewhere around 7 or 8% a year after inflation, and it drew you a smooth, gently rising line up to your target and beyond. But the market has never once, in its entire history, moved in a smooth, gently rising line. It lurches, it crashes, it soars. It goes nowhere for a decade and then triples in 3 years. The average is real over 100 years. It is a complete fiction over the specific 30 years that happen to be your retirement. You don't get the average. You get whatever actually happens in whatever order it happens. And the order, it turns out, is everything. Which brings us to the rule sitting underneath almost every retirement plan on earth, the 4% rule. And I need to be honest with you about where it actually came from. The 4% rule says you can withdraw 4% of your savings in your first year of retirement. Adjust it a little for inflation each year after, and your money should last about 30 years. It's everywhere. It's the beating heart of most retirement advice. And it's genuinely useful. I'm not here to trash it. But here is what nobody tells you. It is a rule of thumb, not a law of physics. It came from someone looking backward at market history and asking what withdrawal rate would have survived the worst stretches of the past. It's a wearing a lab coat kind of rule, dressed up as certainty, when underneath, it's really just a well-educated guess about a future that has never been obligated to resemble the past. It usually works. Usually. And usually is a very different word from safe, especially when the thing you're being safe about is not running out of money while you're too old to go back to work. So if the number is an average nobody actually gets, and the rule protecting it is a usually not always guess, then what's the thing that actually decides whether you end up like Ellen or like Frank? This is the part almost nobody understands. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's called sequence of returns risk, and it is the quiet monster hiding under the whole retirement bed. Here's the idea, and I'm gonna make it simple. When you're saving for retirement, the order of good and bad years barely matters. A crash in your 30s is almost a gift because you're buying cheap and you've got decades to recover. But the moment you retire and start pulling money out, the order flips from harmless to life or death. Because now, when the market crashes, you're not just watching your balance drop, you're also selling shares to live on at the worst possible prices, locking in the loss permanently. And every dollar you pull out during a crash is a dollar that isn't there to recover when the market comes roaring back. That's the entire difference between Ellen and Frank. Ellen happened to retire into a few good years first. Her money grew before she'd taken much out, so she was pulling from a bigger, stronger pile for the rest of her life. Frank retired into a couple of bad years right at the start. He was forced to sell into the crash, his pile got gutted early, and it never, ever recovered because there was less and less left to grow each time the market rose. Same average return over 30 years. Identical. The market was equally kind to both of them on average. It just handed Ellen the good years first and Frank the bad years first. And that single accident of timing, which neither of them chose, was the whole ballgame. The calculator never mentioned it. The calculator can't. It only knows averages. And this is a risk that lives entirely in the order. Let me make it concrete, because this sounds abstract until you watch it happen. Picture Frank's first year. The market drops 30%. So his million becomes 700,000. But he still needs to live. So he pulls out his 40,000 for the year, and now he's down to 660. The next year, the market limps along, he pulls another 40, and he's scraping the low 600s. Now the market finally recovers and surges, but it's surging on $600,000 instead of $1 million. So the recovery lifts a much smaller pile, and he never claws back the ground he lost. Ellen ran the identical percentages in the opposite order. Her first 2 years were strong. Her million grew to 1.3 before she'd taken much out, and every withdrawal for the rest of her life came off a fortress instead of a ruin. Freeze both of them at the 10-year mark, and Ellen has more than she started with, while Frank has already lost half. And again, the market gave them the exact same average. Order did all of it. And look, if this is making your stomach tighten a little, if you're realizing your own tidy little number never accounted for any of this, that exact feeling is why I built a school community. It's where I break down how I take this kind of research and turn it into a faceless YouTube channel that actually grows. The digging, the scripting, the whole system, step by step. No gatekeeping, no upsell. If you've ever thought about building something of your own out of this exact kind of curiosity, the links are in the description. Come hang out. Now, sequence risk is the dramatic villain, the one that decides comfort versus fear. But there's a second thief that works slower and quieter, and it robs everyone, no luck required. Inflation. Here's what the calculator quietly glosses over. Your retirement isn't a moment. It's a 30-year stretch of not earning while prices keep climbing. And inflation doesn't stop just because you stop working. At a completely normal, boring rate of inflation, prices roughly double about every 25 years. So think about what that means for Frank and Ellen. The $1 million that felt like a fortress at 65 buys about half as much by the time they're 90. The grocery bill doubles. The utility bill doubles. The exact same modest life costs twice as many dollars, and their savings never got the memo. So a plan that looks perfectly comfortable in year one can quietly become a plan where you're covering half your real expenses by the end. Not because you overspent, but because the dollars themselves shrank while you weren't looking. The number didn't fail you. The meaning of the number leaked out of it, 1 year at a time for 30 years. And here's why this one is so sneaky. It's invisible in any single year. 3% inflation is nothing. You barely feel it. Groceries cost a little more, you shrug, you move on. But retirement isn't a single year. It's 30 of them stacked back to back. And that gentle 3% compounds in the background the entire time, quietly, relentlessly, the same way your investments compound except working against you. The $40,000 a year that felt generous at 65 needs to be something like $80,000 a year by 90 just to buy the identical life. If your plan assumed a flat $40,000 forever, it wasn't a retirement plan. It was a slow motion pay cut you scheduled for your oldest, most vulnerable self. And then there are the two costs. The calculator lowballs the hardest, and together they can wreck an otherwise fine plan. The first is how long you're going to live. Most people plan, if they plan at all, to about 85, because that's roughly average. But here's the trap in that word again. Average means half of people live longer. If you plan to 85 and you're one of the perfectly ordinary people who lives to 95, you have just designed a plan that runs out of money a full decade before you run out of life. And those are the worst 10 years to be broken, the ones where you have the least ability to do anything about it. Planning for the average lifespan is, mathematically, planning to have a coin flip chance of outliving your money, and nobody frames it that way because it's a horrible thing to say to someone at their retirement party. The second lowball cost is healthcare, and it's the one the friendly calculator loves to ignore entirely. As you age, medical costs don't just rise, they can explode. And a serious health event late in life or a stretch of long-term care can vaporize a retirement fund that looked bulletproof on paper. The calculator hands you one clean number for expenses, as if your costs at 90 will look like your costs at 65. They won't. There's a whole expensive chapter waiting at the end that most plans simply pretend isn't coming. And the cruelest part is how these two costs conspire together. The longer you live, the more likely you are to hit exactly the expensive medical chapter that drains the fund. And the further along you are, the fewer years and options you have to absorb it. So it's not two separate risks sitting politely in their own lanes. It's one compounding trap where living longer, the thing you're supposed to want, is also the thing that raises the odds of the bill that ends the whole plan. A previous generation had a quiet backstop here that most people today simply don't. A pension that paid until the day you died, no matter how long that took. A guaranteed floor that didn't care about sequence or longevity at all. That safety net largely got replaced by a personal savings pile that very much does run out. And the responsibility for making it last got handed to you personally with a calculator and a cheerful thumbs up. So let me say the uncomfortable thing plainly. The retirement math you were handed rests on a stack of hopeful assumptions. That you'll get the average return in a friendly order with tame inflation, an average lifespan, and no financial surprises from your own body. And every single one of those can break, and some of them will. But I promised you this wasn't doom, and I meant it. So let me steel man the other side, because the optimistic case is real, and I'd be lying to leave it out. Here's the honest good news. For the vast majority of disciplined savers, the system does actually work. The 4% rule, despite everything I said, survived the Great Depression, survived the 70s, survived 2008 in the historical testing. Most people who invest steadily for decades and don't panic do end up okay, often better than okay. Sequence risk is real, but it's a risk, not a guarantee. And plenty of people retire into perfectly fine sequences. Social Security, whatever its problems, is a real inflation-adjusted floor underneath you that the doomers love to forget. And the very act of understanding these hidden variables puts you miles ahead of the person who never looked, because now you can build a plan that accounts for them instead of getting ambushed. The point was never that retirement is impossible. The point is that hit one number and you're automatically safe was always too simple. And simple is what gets people hurt. So let me compress this whole thing into 3 beats, in case you drifted off somewhere around the sequence risk. Your retirement number is an average, and nobody retires into an average. The order the market moves in, plus inflation, plus how long you live, can turn the same number into comfort or catastrophe. And certainty was always the illusion. The goal was never a perfect number. It was a plan that survives bad luck. Averages aren't destinies. Order and inflation decide everything. Robust beats precise. Now here's what actually protects you, because being scared of these variables is useless unless it changes what you build. The answer is not a bigger magic number. The answer is a plan that bends instead of snapping. First, build in a cushion. Don't plan to the edge of the average, plan past it. Aim to have more than the calculator's tidy target. and treat the extra not as greed, but as armor against a bad sequence and a long life. Second, stay flexible with your spending. The single most powerful defense against sequence risk costs nothing. It's simply being willing to pull out a little less in the years right after a market drop instead of rigidly taking your full 4% while the market is on fire. Retirees who can dial their spending down temporarily in bad years dramatically outlast the ones who can't. Third, keep a reserve of safe money, a cushion of cash, or something stable, so that when the market crashes early, you can live off that instead of being forced to sell your investments at the bottom. That one move diffuses the exact monster that killed Frank. And fourth, keep some of your money invested for growth even in retirement, because you might be funding 30 or 40 years, and a pile that stops growing is a pile that inflation slowly strangles. None of that is a magic number. All of it is a plan that survives being wrong, which is the only kind of plan worth having, because you will be wrong about something. Everyone is. The winners aren't the ones who guessed the future correctly. They're the ones who built something that didn't need them to. So think about Ellen and Frank one more time. The difference between them wasn't the number. They had the identical number. It wasn't discipline. They were equally disciplined. It was that one of them got lucky with the order of the years and one of them didn't. And neither had built a plan flexible enough to bend when the luck went bad. Frank didn't need a bigger number at 65. He needed a cushion, a reserve, to ride out those first ugly years, and the willingness to spend a little less while the storm passed. Any one of those might have saved him. He had none of them, because the math he trusted never told him he needed them. That's the whole point. The retirement math nobody wants to show you isn't there to terrify you. It's there so you stop trusting a single number as if it were a fortress and start building something that can actually take a hit. Certainty was never on the menu. It never was for anyone. But robustness is. And robustness is better because it works in the real world instead of the brochure. So here's a question I'll leave you sitting with. Of all the hidden variables we just opened up, the order of returns, inflation over decades, living longer than you planned, the healthcare bill at the end, which one had you never once accounted for? And what would your plan look like if, starting today, you finally did? Sit with that one. And if you want to figure it out next to other people doing the same thing, you already know where I'll be. I'll see you in the next one.